other folks join us. I'm Christina Bache. I'm the chair of the UN Working Group on Business for Peace. I'm also a research affiliate with Queen's University and an adjunct faculty member at the Brussels School of Governance. We're very happy for you all to join us today for a discussion on the nexus of business and the Women, Peace and Security agenda. Today's webinar is recorded, and within a week's time, the recording will be uploaded to our website for you to go back and watch, or for you to share. On our website, we also have the recordings of previous webinars. So we just uploaded the last one that we had that looked at the intersectionality of business and human rights and peace building, with a specific focus on Libya. And we welcome some colleagues from the US Institute for Peace who are working in that area. The next webinar that we will have will be on December 9th, and we will welcome our founding co-chair, John Katsos, who is on the call, who is affiliated at the American University of Sharjah, and he will present on examples of companies navigating management, if I'm not mistaken, pardon John, I can't remember the exact title, but in conflict environments. And I would like to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Louisa Murphy from the Principles for Responsible Management Education, who will tell us a little bit more about Prime, before her then handing the virtual microphone back over to me to provide a few remarks before then welcoming our core guest speaker, Ms. B. Delgado from the UN Global Compact UK network. So Louisa, if I could go ahead and turn it over to you, that would be much appreciated.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Christina, for the very warm welcome as always. And really just sharing my screen now, but a very warm welcome to all of you. And thanks so much for joining us today. It's such a pleasure for me, I know personally, to engage in these webinars. I always learn so much within really just 1 hour of time. So yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. I will tell you a little bit about Prime. I know many of you are probably already familiar with Prime. Prime stands for the Principles for Responsible Management Education. We are an initiative of the United Nations Global Compact, a sister initiative. We were started in 2007 by an international task force of deans and university presidents and different faculty members that were really had this wonderful idea to start this initiative with the idea that if you want to change business, you need to teach business differently. So with that, in 2007, we started with the vision and mission to raise the sustainability profile of business schools. And we currently work through 6 principles, which we are also, by the way, revising at the moment. So if you know the principles and have any input, I'd love to hear from you. That's a side note. I'll provide my name in the chat. But we do work through 6 principles to provide future business leaders with the skills they need to address the Sustainable Development Goals. And we do this by aligning with the issue areas and of course the core areas of the United Nations Global Compact. Just to give you a brief idea of our reach in the world, we currently have 870 plus signatories. We hope by the end of the year to have 1,000. As the UN Global, we're lucky and fortunate enough that the academic participants of the UN Global Compact will actually be joining us in the new year. We are currently present in, it's actually 98 countries, and we have 17 regional chapters that are part of our network. And these chapters are really our arms and legs on the ground that help us promote responsible management education by working through different business schools, of course. And last but not least, and important for today, are the 9 working groups that are really central to the success of Prime as well. Business for Peace being a key working group of Prime, and we're very proud of all the great work they're doing. So yeah, that's, we have 9, as I mentioned, working groups, and they're on different issue areas related to the SDGs. As you can see, for instance, we have a working group on human rights, climate change, gender equality, sustainability mindset, sustainable finance. So these issues all link to the UN Global Compact's work, and really our working groups are, yeah, as I mentioned, central to our vision and mission. They are comprised, if you're not aware of it already, of international experts in the fields, in the different fields, and they work internationally. But I will end there and pass the microphone back to Christina. And thank you for your attention, and really encourage you to contact me if you have any questions or concerns about Prime. I'd love to talk to you more about the initiative. So thank you, and back to you, Christina.
And then if I could just briefly share my screen, I would like to show you our website, if I can get you to it. We have a website where you can see, if I don't show you my email address, you can see where we have the previous webinars, as well as a repository of publications that look at the Business for Peace space. And so we are always open to including any publications or resources that you feel we should share and include on the website. For us, our history kind of timeline is that we were founded in 2014 by 2 academics, Robert McNulty from Bentley College and John Katos, who I mentioned earlier, will present his work next month and is affiliated with American University in Sharjah. For us, we're a group of academics as well as practitioners who aim to advance the discussion and also promote and support the development of scholarly research on the engagement of the private sector in fragile and conflict-affected environments, and how business engagement through their core operations affect the conditions that can oftentimes lead to durable peace, or on the flip side, instigate violence and further armed conflict along. That's about it for us. I will go ahead and share a PowerPoint presentation so that I can provide you a few remarks with regards to the importance of today's topic, which is strengthening the nexus of business and the women, peace and security agenda. I am really delighted for this topic today because it's at the core of my research and professional interest. I am oftentimes in 2 different communities, one which is the engagement of the private sector, and the other flip side is the community, the practitioners and academics and specialists who focus on the women, peace and security agenda. But this missing component often happens to be the importance of women's economic inclusion to deepening and broadening the meaningful participation of women across all spheres of society, especially when it comes to fragile and conflict-affected environments. So if I am hoping to kind of share 3 main points with you all today, and that is 1, why gender equality and women's meaningful inclusion in society is important to peace, and secondly, the importance of women's economic inclusion, and then hopefully, which would then lead to a nice transition to B's presentation, which is what business can do. So we know that numerous high-level international agreements, including the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, UN Global Compact, the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, all highlight the linkages between fragility and inequality. Of course, it's now widely accepted that strengthening gender equality and women's human rights is a human rights obligation and key to cultivating peace and security. So indeed, we can see data sets on global peace and security indicate that countries with higher levels of gender equality, such as Iceland, Norway, and Sweden, also experience high levels of peace. And on the flip side, or vice versa, countries with low levels of gender equality tend to also have low levels of peace. If I can move to the next slide here, show you a little bit of academic perspectives. And I strongly believe this is a very important starting point, because how we define and analyze peace and security is critical to understanding the context in which we operate, and to devising positive ways to engage in communities. So we have here the negative peace paradigm, which refers to an absence of physical or direct violence, whereas on the other hand, the positive peace paradigm refers to an absence of structural violence, the depth of social justice, equality, human rights, participatory forms of governance, inclusive economic opportunity, and society's social relations. And with regards to security paradigms, traditional or national security perspectives promote regime stability and tend to prioritize defense and military issues, whereas human security perspectives transcend the security of the state, prioritizing the protection of the individual to live a dignified life free from fear and want, and considering the multitude of political, economic, and social issues. So of course, context matters, and a one-size-fits-all framework doesn't exist. Still, businesses should be aware of these different viewpoints about peace and security to understand the potential consequences of their engagement, especially in regards to fragile and conflict-affected environments. So moving along, as mentioned, the level of gender equality and more specifically women's meaningful inclusion, where women have decision-making authority across all spheres of society, is critical to inclusive peace and development. Women's economic inclusion is vital to making that a reality, and is also essential to broadening women's participation from diverse socioeconomic, political, and religious backgrounds, while also recognizing the intersectionality of identity. So UN Women refers to economic inclusion or economic security as a woman's or women's ability to participate equally in existing markets, access to and control over productive resources, assets, and savings, access to decent and dignified work, whether a woman has control over her time, her life, and her body, and whether or not she has an increased voice, agency, and meaningful participation, particularly in the economic sphere, economic decision-making at all levels, from the household to international institutions. So women's capacity to absorb economic, environmental, health, and political shocks is typically less than men, mainly due to numerous structural inequalities. And of course, we've seen these issues exacerbated in the last year and a half in light of the global pandemic. Women earn less, hold less secure jobs, and are more likely to be employed in the informal sector, which means less access to social protections, resources, savings, and capital. And women make up the majority of single-parent households and perform the majority of unpaid work. In this slide, you can see some of the factors that influence women's economic inclusion, including discrepancies between national laws protecting women and the enforcement of those laws, which can profoundly impact women's agency and economic security. Economic systems sustained by women and girls who are not adequately compensated and valued for their contributions and capabilities, severely compromised prospects for inclusive development. And while business cannot substitute the need for good governance structures, nor can business completely dislodge the structural barriers that restrict women's agency on their own, business can bolster gender equality and women's participation in the economy by easing access to the labor market and improving job retention. And here in this slide, this is another multitude of resources and policies that businesses can pursue or adopt to help ease the transition and retention of women in the labor market. But I think it's important for business to understand how gender inequality impacts women, how they can, so that they can potentially mitigate any unintended negative consequences of their operations, and in turn provide tools and opportunities necessary to bolster women's economic inclusion. And then in closing, business is certainly, we know, not the silver bullet to addressing all of society's ills. Of course, there are many examples of business reinforcing gender inequality, instigating social tension, engaging in corrupt practices, and even furthering or contributing to war economies. But I would say that from my research and my experience, companies do have the know-how, the innovation, the drive, the capital necessary to transform societies, at least to be one of the actors in a multitude of responses. And so I think it is worth furthering the discussion about how business can bolster the meaningful inclusion of women in society and thus enhance the conditions that lead to sustainable peace and development. That would be my wrap up of my points, and I would like to go ahead and turn it over to Ms. Benafsha Delgado, who is the Senior Program Manager at the UK Network, Global Compact UK Network. She is also responsible for the business and human rights stream. And B, if I could turn it over to you to pick up where I just left off, be much appreciated.
Thank you, Christina. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon. And thank you for the opportunity to come and talk about our most recent publication at the network in terms of our Women, Peace and Security report. Can I get the slides up, please?
Mm-hmm. Okay, I will just...
Excellent, Christine. Can you just go to the next slide, please? Yeah, thanks. So I'd like to begin with a very brief introduction to the United Nations Global Compact for those of you that may not be very familiar with this initiative. It was launched by the former Secretary General Kofi Annan during the World Economic Forum in Davos back in 1999. And he basically challenged business leaders to initiate a global compact of shared values and principles to give a human face to the global market. So he had identified a gap within the UN system that didn't really address how businesses could act responsible if they wanted to. And so therefore, he came up with the idea of the compact as a framework to support businesses' efforts on this issue. So initially 40 businesses signed up, and shortly after, the Global Compact was officially launched the following year. So the Global Compact is a call to companies to align their strategies and operations with 10 universal principles. They're rooted in international declarations and conventions, and they're namely in the areas of human and labour rights, environment and anti-corruption. The principles themselves represent the minimum responsibilities that each business has to respect in order to safeguard both people and the planet. Next slide, please, Christina. Thank you. So since the launch of the initiative, there are now over 14,000 businesses that have joined and over 3,800 non-business participants that have done the same to support the purpose of the Global Compact. We operate across 160 countries globally through 70 local networks, one of which is us in the UK. Next slide, please. So local networks act as the focal points for companies who sign up to the Global Compact. Our role is to support our members to both realise and communicate on the 10 principles, and our activities within the network fall into 3 main work streams, which are business and human rights, climate action and global goals. Throughout the year, we host a series of webinars, annual summits, workshops, working groups, to name but a few. As a local network, we're in a very unique position in that we have the opportunity to directly engage with the private sector on issues that are usually highly sensitive and require careful thought and consideration in terms of how best to address them, but also have the opportunity to engage with other very relevant stakeholders such as civil society and the government. Next slide, please. In 2020, we started to think about the gaps in the business and human rights space and which ones we could address through our business and human rights program. One of those gaps was business action on women, peace and security. So for a long time, we've been aware of business action that supports gender equality and women's rights, just like there's been a lot of work done in terms of making us aware of the different business oriented tools and initiatives for fostering peace. But no one seemed to really look at the intersection between those 2 areas. And that's where we thought that we could begin to play a role. Next slide, please, Christina. So as our guide states, 2020 also marked the 20th anniversary of the UN Global Compact and the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325, which obviously established the Women, Peace and Security agenda. So to us, this seemed like an opportune time to start the conversation and think about the touch points between both WPS and responsible business. So in other words, we wanted to encourage business actors to conduct responsible business and apply a gender lens to their operations, predominantly in fragile and conflict affected areas. So this guide was developed on the basis of 2 WPS themed webinars we organised last year, extensive in-house research and input from external partners. It's structured into several sections, including context setting on business, gender equality, peace and security, followed by responsible business frameworks that can help support the WPS agenda, as well as additional actions for business to support. In a nutshell, the guide recommends that businesses take a two-pronged approach to enabling the WPS agenda. Firstly, companies should do no harm to women in fragile and conflict-affected areas by following the relevant business frameworks and conducting heightened human rights due diligence. Secondly, once this prerequisite has been fulfilled, companies can do good by enacting additional actions in support of the WPS agenda. Next slide, please. So this guide was conceived to raise awareness of the role businesses can play in mitigating risks to women's rights and advancing the WPS agenda. So it does this by explaining the interconnections between these topics, highlighting the rationale for business to contribute to women's empowerment, and provides example on how to do this. It outlines the key business responsibilities and the frameworks available for action relevant to the WPS agenda. It should be taken as a starting point for companies wishing to learn about the WPS agenda, as well as providing guidance and inspiration for businesses that are already engaged. While we believe that this guide is the first, or at least one of the first resources to do so, we certainly hope that it won't be the last, nor the most comprehensive one going forward, as we really believe that these conversations should be expanded and built upon. Next slide, please. If you look at the chapter of the guide which goes into context setting, you'll be able to find lots of interesting research and pieces of information about gender equality, peace, security and business, and how all these different topics are interrelated. This chapter also provides the reader with a business case for incorporating a gender responsive lens to business operations in fragile and conflict affected areas. It also lists all the relevant global actors and instruments which work in the WPS space and on responsible businesses more broadly, including the UN Global Compact, UN Women, and many civil society organisations. This discussion then segues into the key responsible business frameworks that can help support the WPS agenda. We identified 4 key ones, namely the UN Guiding Principles, the Sustainable Development Goals, the Women's Empowerment Principles, and the 10 Principles of the UN Global Compact. However, we also do suggest additional tools and resources that companies can make use of in this context. If I take one of those examples, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, this really affords business with the opportunity to realise their responsibility to respecting human rights and moves away from the more traditional responsibility of businesses mitigating risk to profits and their operations, and shifting that responsibility to ensuring that they do no harm to people. Next slide, please. Perhaps the most illustrative section of the guide is the 4th chapter. This outlines 4 key areas of action for responsible business that want to do even more for the WPS agenda, beyond just doing no harm. And this provides real-world examples and case studies that companies can take inspiration from. Specifically, these 4 key areas of action are core business activities, strategic social investments and philanthropy, rights holder-centered advocacy and public policy engagement, and lastly, partnerships, including other kinds of collective action. Next slide, please. So to wrap up, our guide argues that businesses can create positive enabling environments for the WPS agenda, and to keep this agenda moving forward by first doing no harm to women in fragile and conflict affected areas, and by following relevant guidance on responsible business and women's empowerment. In addition to this, businesses can set up an ongoing human rights due diligence process that considers all frameworks I mentioned earlier. They can also do good by taking additional actions to support the WPS agenda. So as explained throughout the guide, the interconnections between gender equality, peace, security and business are deep, complex and often sensitive, and businesses wishing to make positive contributions to this agenda should take every possible care to be responsible when engaging with it. And as shown by the case studies we mentioned throughout the report, this kind of business action in support of the WPS agenda should definitely, hopefully, yield positive results. Next slide, please. So I'd like to finish the presentation by just saying that for those of you who haven't had the opportunity to download the report, please follow this link and you can do so through our website. And if anyone has any questions, whether it's on this agenda or the report itself, please feel free to contact myself or my colleague, Cora. Thanks very much, and really happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Yeah, thanks so much, B. I think, again, I would reiterate the importance and the value of this report, that you have brought together these different perspectives and have highlighted the importance that although they may be different, they're all working towards the same aim, which is trying to encourage, trying to broaden, deepen women's meaningful participation across all spheres of society, and in turn bolster the frameworks that lead to sustainable peace and inclusive development. I would be curious to know if anybody has any questions or comments. If you do, I think normally we don't have necessarily as much time, so we ask people to write their questions in the chat. But I think because we are a smaller group today as well, if you could maybe go ahead and unmute yourself, introduce yourself as well, maybe tell us who you are, who you're affiliated with, or which professional affiliation you may want to share with us, and then your question or comment. I think Ben was the first one to raise his hand, so I invite you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
My name is Ben Rutledge. I'm working with the OECD Responsible Business Conduct Centre here in France. Thanks very much for the invitation to join, and congratulations on the WPS guidance. I had a question on the UK context for B, or indeed if anyone else would be willing or able to provide their thoughts. And I just wanted to ask what you saw as, if there's any evidence that legislation or policy in the UK context is moving the needle on this issue and stimulating responsible business conduct and helping businesses apply a gender lens to business operations in complex supply chain operations. We know that guidance helps businesses develop their internal practices, but we also know, I think, that whilst there are leaders making progress on this issue, it's often the case that they don't represent the majority of businesses. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts on policies in the UK context that are moving this debate forward. Thank you.
Yeah, happy to jump in there. Thank you for the question, Ben. Definitely, I think amongst our members, there is increasing need for reflecting on what good human rights due diligence looks like, and therefore the need to really understand what's happening in global supply chains. And so traditionally, where some of our members perhaps would think that issues of peace and security are not something that fall underneath a business's remit, they're beginning to understand that companies definitely play a role in this agenda, and it's becoming increasingly difficult not to acknowledge that role, but also to kind of demonstrate what positive action looks like in addressing these issues. And if we think about global supply chains, we're seeing that the trajectory seems to be a push and a move towards further legislation and regulation. So that's definitely giving, I think, companies the impetus that's needed to be able to act on this agenda.
That's great. I think if I could welcome Ashley to join the conversation?
Hi, I really appreciate the focus on due diligence within the report. And I'm wondering if there were any concrete recommendations or findings that you have related to due diligence in conflict sensitive areas. I know that it's usually extremely difficult. Unusual processes of due diligence, especially relating to women, can be even more difficult than usual. So any recommendations would be lovely to hear your thoughts.
Thanks for the question, Ashley. I think while we were drafting the report, one of the key findings that did come to light, as you've rightly mentioned, is this complexity around conducting human rights due diligence in fragile and conflict affected areas. And one of the, I think the key considerations is working with meaningful partners. So, you know, acknowledging that in order to confidently say that the due diligence process that a company is conducting on the ground in these regions is both successful and positive, really relies on working with different stakeholder groups. So it's not a case, although the company may be leading on the due diligence process, it's definitely key to try and talk to other stakeholders who have a closer ear to the ground in some cases in terms of what's happening and how they can then map that against the risks to people. Unfortunately, beyond that, there aren't really any kind of concrete recommendations that we would give business beyond, you know, ensuring that different stakeholder groups are spoken to and engaged with it throughout certain parts of the due diligence process.
B, I know we also talked a few weeks ago about, or last week, about practical application of such a guidance or of some case studies. Could you share any of that with us?
Yeah, definitely. I think often when we're talking about an issue as complex as this and the WPS agenda, concrete issues definitely help bring to life some of the intent behind business doing no harm and actually demonstrating positive impact and action. So there are various examples that we use throughout the report to help showcase this. And one of those comes from a private sector company called Committed to Good. And what they do is they support development programs in conflict affected areas by providing specialized human resources and program management services. And in 2017, they launched Female First, which was a gender parity recruitment program. And what this did is it encouraged their recruiters, their in-country teams and their clients to help improve women's access to decent work opportunities in humanitarian roles in conflict affected areas. So their goal really is that by 2030, 30% of its project staff will be women represented in these conflict regions. So that's kind of just one example of a company. They are a professional services company, which in some respects perhaps is easier to kind of demonstrate what that action looks like on the ground, and it can be trickier for other types of companies. However, it's not impossible. And again, in the report, we do talk about some companies and multinationals. So another one is BP, or namely BP in Angola. And they partnered with the Halo Trust, who is responsible for demining former and current conflict affected areas around the world. And what they did is they BP donated a significant amount of money to help train all female demining teams to ensure that land in Angola were safe from landmines going forward. And what this allowed the 85 women that were involved in this particular program to do is take more control of their lives whilst playing a really, really important role in the future of their country. And there are other examples. We have another one called REN-FM, and it's an organization based in the Democratic Republic of Congo. For those of you that are aware of that particular region of the world and kind of the commodities coming out of their mining is probably one of the the most popular source of income for the local population, and therefore communities heavily rely on employment in this sector. But as many of us are aware, the mines often are located in regions where there is severe conflict and historical risks associated with that. And so this organization really acts as an advocate for women in the mining sector. So it helps through programs to train them and enable them to have opportunities and access to resources that would empower them within this sector, which traditionally is heavily operated and controlled by men. And so it's another example of what businesses can do on the ground directly, and in some cases indirectly through their own global supply chains.
Yeah, Alexi, would you like to join?
Yes, thank you. My name is Alexi. I am a part of the Young Ambassadors Program for WCAP's Women of Color Advancing Peace and National Security and Conflict Transformation. My question is more of, I'm obviously in the United States, so does this report, can it extend to the US chapter, and do you foresee that happening in the future?
That's a really good question, Alexi. I think when we did draft this report, because the nature of our members, they operate on a global scale. So, although we're based in the UK, we'd like to think that a lot of the recommendations and the business frameworks are applicably globally. I think that the bigger question is in terms of the context itself. And I strongly believe that if a business is operating in a fragile or conflict affected area, wherever that may be around the world, it doesn't necessarily matter where they're headquartered, but it's more about that local context and really understanding that the issues happening on the ground, and then how do they then, take the next steps. So acknowledge that the problem is there, and now how do we use these existing business frameworks to ensure that we do no harm to people.
Thank you. And sorry if I could ask another question to build off of what you just said about the local context. I think it's really interesting to include, and I don't know if you have partnerships with real estate firms or, property development businesses, because I've personally worked in that industry and I have seen how there is a misallocation or misunderstanding or not, that doesn't include these conversations, that these conversations don't generally aren't talked about during meetings. And I think that it would be very beneficial to those types of businesses and in that type of industry to include this conversation.
So within the UK, I mean, membership is opening to all sorts of different companies from numerous different sectors. So I don't think that at the moment we do have a property development company who are members. However, the majority of our events and our webinars are free, so access is open to anybody, whether or not they're in the UN Global Compact or otherwise. In terms of your question around the local context, as I said earlier in my presentation, we have got over 70 local networks globally. So this is a really unique way to engage with companies closer to the ground. So, although we're dealing primarily with multinational companies here in the UK, we also acknowledge that there are lots of SMEs that also share the same challenges, and some of them may have operations in these kind of fragile and conflict affected areas. So it's through our other local networks who are also based in these regions that we have the access to those companies, and we're able to then engage with them. And it's almost, if you like, a peer-to-peer learning process, because you have the companies who are based in these hotspots feeding kind of back what's happening, what the key issues are, and then you have the companies in the UK that are mainly primarily driven at the moment by legislation. And so, you know, the trouble is that the space in the middle, and that's the vacuum that's been created, and that's where the UN Global Compact is trying to play a key role, to try and bring all of these relevant stakeholder groups together, and kind of steer away now from the conversation and move more towards what practical action in this space looks like.
Yeah, I think is Annika, would you like to join the conversation? I think you just need to unmute yourself. There you are.
So I'm talking for France. I work at the University of Lille and I just have the Institute of Research for Peace in Paris. In fact, I was thinking to make a question about the role of education in peace. While I see that it is important to get communities that different kinds of activities, different kinds of programs, especially one is the one which are called conflict or but my question is, if I teach, for example, geopolitics and international trade,
I think, Annika, I'm sorry, I think we're all struggling to understand your question. It was something about, you're calling from France, but it sounds like you're much farther. And something about...
Do you hear me now?
Oh, yes, so much better. So much better. Can you please start over?
Apparently. Okay, so I am, okay, so I restart. I am working at the University of Lille and at the same time, Peace Research Institute in Paris. I'm mainly focused in research for peace, and at the same time, I am interested in involving peace issues in the education. And one of the questions was going to be how the project, for example, involve the issues of education in building peace, besides involving women in different business activities or empowering them. I teach one, for example, subject that is geopolitics of international trade, and I am wondering what should I tell students on the topic of peace, because normally what I teach are geopolitical elements which normally try to do business in an environment where there is too much rivalry, and you may also expect contracts to be breached because of political questions, as we have been seeing recently, for example. But I don't know, I'm wondering if there is a kind of a proposal how to include those issues in class. Of course, I teach normally the concept, but to be precise, for example, on issues such as trade or business, so what can we tell students? Because I think peace starts in the mind before getting into practice. So how can we build peace in the mind of people, starting from students? Thank you.
B, did you get that? It's also about awareness building, right? I mean, in terms of how we perceive peace, peace and security. Maybe you could maybe elaborate on that, B, in your interfacing with the different companies that are members of the Global Compact UK network. I mean, do they have a understanding? Do they understand these different, peace and security paradigms?
Yeah, sorry, Christina. Annika, I do apologize. I did really struggle to hear you and the question. And if I understood it correctly, Christina, I think, awareness raising is a huge piece in this very, very complex puzzle. And as I said before, more traditionally, businesses would see something like peace and security as part of government policy and something that didn't really pertain to their sector, and therefore not something that, as far as respecting peace and security goes, that's something that they thought was their responsibility, but anything beyond that, really, they didn't really understand or acknowledge and make those links. That is now shifting, and I think that's a huge win in itself, that, you know, that it's now we have business frameworks and we have initiatives and instruments in place that make that link a lot clearer. So if we do take, you know, as I mentioned earlier, the UN guiding principles, for example, you know, it's forcing businesses to not only think about harm and risk in the traditional sense of, you know, profit and the impact it's going to have on their business operations themselves and the assets, but it's shifting the mindset to think about how does our business impact people and how can we ensure that we do no harm. Well, doing no harm, and part of that responsibility includes ensuring that they're not, you know, complicit in hampering peace efforts. And I think, just because I'm slightly going off tangent here, but it was a point I wanted to make earlier in my presentation, and I forgot, was, you know, the UN working group on business and human rights, and we mentioned this in the report. They remind us that, you know, businesses can play both the role of the friend but also the foe, and so, you know, by operating in a fragile and conflict affected area, by default, they're already part of the issues happening there. And so, you know, although they may not be participating in events that are leading to insecurity and instability, the fact that they are there, you know, they're not what we call a neutral actor. And therefore, if businesses begin to see the problem and the women, peace and security agenda within that light, then they can really begin to kind of address some of those issues accordingly. So I do apologize. I know I slightly went off tangent, Enika. I don't know, Christine, if you.
I also asked something. How can we include those issues in the education, especially teaching students about peace, grounding peace in the mind of people, because then they will be the ones which will work in different companies, sectors, and will bring the idea of peace from the beginning. So this is something interesting that I would like to know, as I am teaching, for example, for geopolitics of international trade. And that's true that sometimes businesses are, how to say, not explicitly, but directly involved in the conflict issues, because they are in some sensible sectors that may affect politics at higher level, and even get countries into conflict if the topic is very sensitive and exchanges involved has to do with security issues, or prevent somehow future confrontation or future imposition as a power that control the area of the business or the market or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, education is definitely not, you know, something that we focus on specifically at the UK network, but I will say this: students of today, in some respects, are already a few steps ahead of the game if you compare them to previous generations. The reality is that they are part of and engaged with movements on gender equality, peace, security. They're better versed in these issues, if you like, than previous generations. And as you mentioned, Enika, these are the very same people that will one day be practitioners, whether that's in the private sector, within government, or even civil society organizations. So already they're one step ahead of the game, because the fact that these issues are in their psyche and they are aware of them means that they can then be better positioned to act on those things. I think in terms of keeping students engaged on these issues, you can kind of shift the conversation in terms of whether they would want to engage as consumers, so exerting pressure on the private sector through that channel, or whether it's as practitioners in the future. But I do think just the amount of level of exposure that students have to these issues puts them on almost, if you like, a more positive footing to be able to address these issues.
I think I may add a comment in that I just wrote a blog piece on this topic this last week for Prime, in that traditional security perspectives, I would say, are generally the ones that are more widely accepted by public, and that critical peace and security paradigms are still relegated to the fields of international relations, political science, and sociology. And so that you do see management, business and management students really not learning those critical peace and security issues in their curriculum. So I do think that there should be a more broadening of these different disciplines of interdisciplinary work to ensure that business and management students learn those in a more systematic way, rather than just out of personal or professional interest later down the line. I mean, there's only really a few programs where these different international relations, political science, business and management fields come together. And one of them is at my alma mater, American University, where our co-chair, Bob Cincena, is based and is a professor at. He teaches a course on peace through entrepreneurship. And then the School of International Service and the Kogod School of Business try to work together to ensure that students have a multitude of classes where they learn business management, conflict resolution courses, so they get that more multidisciplinary approach in the curriculum. But I do think that's an important point, that we need to kind of, take those critical peace and security paradigms out of just poly and IR departments and into business and management schools. Does anybody else have any last minute questions or comments? Would anybody like to share their work? I know that Shala is working for a very important international NGO who may have some.
I'd just like to say thanks for the plug, Christina.
Always happy to do that, Bob.
Thank you, Christina. I worked for Mercy Corps as the B2 Regional Director, but I transitioned recently, and I'm in DC as non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute. And previously, I worked for USAID in several programs related to the SME. So I come from a practitioner point of view, and as I was listening to this very informative conversation, the main thought comes to mind is, how about all the business hubs that are increasing recently in Iraq and in Jordan? To some extent, what's this report? How this report will operationalize recommendations in areas like Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, and how can we tag into the development programs that are developed or designed by USAID or other institutional donors to address this issue. It suffices to say that recently small businesses are flourishing in areas like Iraq, areas that you wouldn't think of because of security and because of the rentier state mentality, but because of the plummeting of the oil prices and other important factors related to the youth movement, women-owned small businesses are flourishing. And there are so many new business hubs in many remote areas and provinces in Iraq. So as I was listening to this discussion, I was thinking of the venues where we can operationalize such approach in the linkage between business and women empowerment. Thank you.
Anybody else, or B, would you like to respond?
Sorry, Christina, there's a delay. Can you repeat Charlotte's question, please?
Charlotte, would you like to go ahead? I don't.
Very quickly, how we can operationalize these recommendations in areas like Iraq, where, for example, business hubs are flourishing and small business SMEs owned by women are flourishing due to several factors in the country. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think that any of these kind of business frameworks are applicable no matter where geographically. It requires support at the local level, but also to make it more meaningful and sustainable, that the investment has to come from different stakeholder groups. So you mentioned these business hubs, but the reality is that we all know that not just one actor can address this agenda in the way that it needs. So, you know, that the fact that these business hubs are thriving and able to operate in these really, really demanding and complex environments is testament to what's happening on the ground is helpful, but they need the additional support. And whether that one of the many challenges is that you would like to think that local governments and national governments would be playing a bigger role to support the businesses and the business hubs in country, but the reality is that that's not always possible. And if we think about contexts where there's, you know, weak governance or a lack of the rule of law, that possibility becomes even more and more diminished. So, you know, this is, I think, for us drafting this report, you know, and really thinking about how can these actions be implemented on the ground, the more and more thought you give to this, you realize that it's not just a kind of one-man band. You know, you really do need to pool resources, and you really need to bring together different actors to the table if we want to meaningfully address this agenda, both at the local level and also the national level in these conflict areas. So unfortunately, Charlotte, I don't have kind of, you know, one size fits all piece of advice to say, you know, what recommendations in terms of supporting these business hubs. But I would say that where we have local networks on the ground, and some of them do exist in conflict areas. So for example, there is a UNGC Global Compact local network in the DRC. For example, we have another one in Colombia, and they're both extremely successful with engaging businesses on the ground. But a huge part of that success comes in how they interact with their governments, but also how they interact with foreign business. So companies that are showing an interest in engaging and investing in these conflict regions.
Thank you very much. I have a follow-up question, but I know we are at the top of the hour, so I will communicate with you, Christina. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Shala. And I'm happy to put you in touch with B2 afterwards. B, indeed, we are at the final hour. If I could ask you to kindly provide just a few comments, if you'd like, to wrap us up before we say goodbye.
Yeah, thank you, Christina. I think the biggest, you know, if there's one thing to take away from this conversation today, I think it's happening at the right time. You know, we are seeing, and we spoke about it earlier, this shift towards more and more legislation and the onus on businesses to take responsibility for what's happening in their supply chains. And a huge part of that work is what's happening on the ground, where they either have direct business operations or they're sourcing goods. And so, you know, issues of peace and security and the role that women play in that agenda is becoming more and more important for business to have at the forefront of their mind. But also, you know, beyond acknowledging that this is an issue, how do they best support women, and how can they empower women in regions where it's hugely complex for women to operate and have a voice, and what does that look like? And I think the key takeaway message is it's possible. We've seen examples of how the private sector can play a meaningful role, and it's, you know, moving beyond just having conversations, but demonstrating concrete action. So it's possible, it's complex, and it's definitely timely, and it's a conversation that should have happened a long time ago, hasn't, is happening now, and there's a role for each and every one of us to play to ensure that it's a conversation that remains at the forefront of a priority for business moving forward. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, B. And I also have to say thank you to your colleague, Carla Dripic, who, for her leadership in driving this topic of the nexus of business and the women, peace and security agenda. I highly recommend everybody download the report if you haven't done so. Happy to put you in touch with B if you'd like to be in communication with her. Thank you for joining us. We know that the 1 hour seems to be a lot of time, and then before you know it, we're right at the end. So I'm sorry if you weren't able to ask your question or provide a comment. If you have any comments or questions that you would like to ask B, as I said, I'll get you in touch with her. To Luisa, thank you always for your phenomenal support. We also encourage you all to sign up for John Katos's presentation next month, which will be on the 9th of December. And the official title is Thriving in Uncertainty and Crisis, Management Lessons from Companies and Conflict Zones. So we encourage you to join us for that conversation. And otherwise, we wish you a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much, Christina. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, B, so much.
Bye.
Please give my best to Carla.
I will do. Thanks very much. Bye.
Bye-bye.